Imagine a place, its original name meaning breast of the sea. Early visitors, think Charles Darwin, explorers like Spix and Martius, they struggled for words, really, to capture its beauty.
Yeah, absolutely. Guanabara Bay. The sources paint this picture of, well, paradise. Huge harbor, islands, mountains, just magnificent.
A really iconic natural setting, 468 square kilometers of water surface, I read.
That's right. Framed by mountains like the Serra dos Organs. Just stunning historically.
But then you look at the sources describing it today, and it's jarring. Words like stinking, eyesore, a trashy mess.
It's a dramatic shift.
Yeah.
And one source calls it an exclusion territory.
Exclusion territory. What does that mean exactly?
Well, the source defines it as a place so degraded by human activity, by pollution, that it seriously harms people's quality of life. Creates real misery, frankly.
Wow. From paradise to that. That's the story we're diving into today, isn't it? How did this happen?
Exactly. We're digging into these sources, articles, research notes to understand the layers. Environmental, social, historical, political, it's all intertwined.
Right. Our mission is to pull out the key insights, the surprising facts, to help you understand this really complex situation.
We've got historical accounts, scientific studies, social analyses, trying to get a rounded picture for you.
Okay, so let's start with that present-day reality. Huge population living right there.
Huge.
Yeah.
Over 10 million people around the bay. And the data we looked at suggests maybe a third live in favelas, informal settlements.
And another third I saw lack basic sanitation, like no connection to sewage systems at all.
That's the estimate,
Yeah.
which leads directly to, well, a massive problem for the bay.
The sheer amount of raw sewage pouring in, the figures are mind-boggling, 15,000 to 18,000 liters every second.
Every single second. It's almost impossible to grasp that volume.
Yeah.
It's constant.
And it's not just sewage, right? Solid waste, too. Garbage.
Oh, absolutely. A monumental issue. So much trash ends up in the bay that, traditional fishing is just impossible in many areas now.
Which must devastate those fishing communities.
Completely. Generations relied on the bay, and now it's poverty for money. The sources really highlight that connection.
So, okay, that brings us to the ecological side. What does all this pollution do to the bay's life?
Well, it's devastating. Simple
What?
as that. The rivers flowing into the bay, described as black ditches in some reports.
Black ditches. Grim. And habitats are disappearing? I saw mentions of mangroves.
Yes, vital mangrove forests. They're like the bay's kidneys, natural filters. Historically, maybe 260 square kilometers.
And
Now it's down to around 81 square kilometers. There are some reforestation efforts, like in Guapimerim, where cleaner rivers still flow in, which is good. But the overall loss, it's huge.
And losing those natural filters just makes the pollution worse, I suppose.
Exactly. It's a vicious cycle. And you see the impact directly on marine life. The sources talk about bioindicators.
Bioindicators, like specific animals telling us how sick the bay is.
Precisely. The Guyana dolphins are a really stark example.
Yeah.
Tragic, actually.
What happened to them?
Well, estimates from the 1970s put their numbers around 800 in the bay.
800.
By 2016, the count was down to 34.
34 from 800. That's shocking. Is it just the water pollution?
It's pollution, but the research also points to things like noise from ships, dredging.
Yeah.
It all disrupts their habitat.
Wow. And there were other examples too, weren't there? Seahorses?
Yes, seahorses are incredibly sensitive. One study near Ilha do Governador found almost 300 in 2014.
Okay.
A year later, same spot, they found 14.
14. That dramatic drop really tells a story about the water quality.
It screams it, really. Unlivable for these sensitive creatures. It's not just them. Crabs, shrimp, mussels, gone from the most polluted areas where they used to thrive.
And for the fishermen we mentioned, this isn't abstract data. This is their daily reality, right? Their nets tell the story.
Exactly. They're reading those biological indicators, as one source put it, every single day. It's their livelihood vanishing.
So how did we get here?
Hmm?
From paradise to this, the sources suggest it's a long, slow decline, not an overnight thing.
Definitely not overnight. If you go back, early interventions were really driven by health scares. Yellow fever, malaria, big problems in Rio.
So the focus was on sanitation.
Sanitation, yes, but also physically changing the land. Draining swamps, straightening rivers, based on old ideas about bad air causing disease, the miasma theory.
And I remember one source linking this to a social agenda too, something about whitening Brazil.
That's right. The idea was that making the city healthier, more sanitary, would make it more attractive to European immigrants. So public health was tied to these broader goals.
And engineers played a big role in the early 20th
A
century.
huge role. Urban reformers, engineers,
Hmm.
they had these grand visions of a modern kind of European-style city that led to massive projects, building the port, creating embankments like Flamingo Park.
Which actually changed the bay's shape, didn't it? And destroyed wetlands in the process.
Yes, significantly altered the coastline, destroyed crucial natural areas. They were building their planned bay, this idealized vision.
But it wasn't the real bay. It ignored what was actually there.
Exactly. Ignored the existing ecosystems, and often ignored the people living there, especially in the growing favelas. Some sources point out how these settlements were just left off official maps for a long time.
A real disconnect. Okay, so fast forward. There have been big, expensive attempts to clean it up more recently.
Oh yes, big programs. The Guanabara Bay Pollution Cleanup Program, the PDBG back in the 90s,
Yeah.
more recently PSM. We're talking serious money.
Like how much?
Well, the PDBG got around US $800 million.
Mm-hmm.
And some estimates say you'd need something like 12 billion Brazilian reais just for universal sewage treatment. Huge sums.
So money was spent, infrastructure was built. Why didn't it work? What went wrong?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it?
Mm.
The sources point to a whole mess of interconnected problems. First, sewage treatment plants were built,
Okay.
but they often weren't fully operational, maybe running at half capacity, one estimate said. And worse, the pipes needed to actually get the sewage to the plant.
They weren't built or connected.
Largely, no. So you have the plant, but the waste stream isn't reaching it. A fundamental flaw, like you said.
Seems pretty basic.
You'd think so. And even the stuff that did get treated often lacked what's called tertiary treatment.
Which removes.
Nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus. Without removing those, you still get eutrophication, algal blooms, dead zones, poor water quality.
Right. And solid waste wasn't solved either.
No. Big dumps were closed, sure. But daily collection, especially in poorer areas, remained patchy. And recycling rates, extremely low, like maybe 1% in the metro area, according to one source. Plus, leachate from old landfills keeps seeping out.
So technical failures, but also issues with governance, enforcement.
Definitely. Lack of enforcement of regulations, maybe lack of political will, different agencies not coordinating, inspectors just overwhelmed. It's a tangle.
A complex web. I also saw some pretty wild engineering ideas proposed over the years, like giant fountains or circulation systems.
Yeah, things like Cibeo, the Organum hydraulicum, ideas for floating bridges, that Chagres Islands fountain. It shows people were thinking big, maybe desperately, about large-scale fixes.
But none really solved the core issues.
Apparently not. I mean, the fact that the Apanema submarine outfall, built decades ago, still pumps out massive amounts of untreated wastewater.
Mm-hmm.
It tells you the basic problems persist.
Okay, let's shift to the people. The sources talk a lot about the human side of this story.
They do. You have scientists, like Lejeune mentioned in one piece, who documented the decline up close. They faced challenges like their labs becoming too polluted, and they had to build relationships with local communities while studying those bioindicators.
And then the people living right there in the favelas, sometimes on landfill sites.
Yeah, often lacking sanitation themselves, sometimes getting blamed for the pollution, and living under the shadow of potential forced removal. And the sources note the favela population around the bay grew massively, especially from the mid-20th century.
Intensifying that interaction between people and the polluted environment.
All right, and the fishermen. Their stories are just heartbreaking. Livelihoods destroyed by pollution, reading those biological indicators in their empty nets every day.
And one source mentioned threats against fishermen activists.
Yes, really serious stuff. Threats, even violence reported against activists from groups like AHOMAR who were trying to organize and demand change. It shows the risks involved in speaking out.
That adds a really dark layer. What about broader environmental movements? Did they play a role?
Well, initially under the military regime, popular movements were discouraged, suppressed even,
Yeah.
but the sources say they started growing in the 80s. There were protest regattas, for instance, people getting organized against the pollution.
And how did the sources portray the role of the government, the state, in all this?
It's complex. Some historical geographers quoted basically point the finger at the state as the main culprit, citing decades of inaction or bad policy. Others focus more on the huge challenges, coordinating agencies, overcoming apathy, dealing with powerful interests.
So different perspectives on accountability in the materials we reviewed.
Exactly. And we're just relaying those viewpoints found in the sources, not taking a side.
Ugh.
There was also mention of the oil industry's presence.
Ah, yes, refineries, shipping.
Big presence.
Yeah.
And one source noted that even when they were talking about cleaning the bay for the Olympics, the oil industry's impact was sort of off the table, not really questioned. Seen as untouchable, maybe.
Interesting. Okay, so zooming out, why should someone listening care about Guanabara Bay if they don't live in Rio? What's the bigger picture here?
The sources really frame it as more than just a local issue. It's presented as a kind of case study, an example of the intense pressures on coastal environments and urban areas worldwide, especially in developing nations.
A microcosm of global challenges.
Exactly. It shows how tightly environmental protection is linked to social issues, poverty, infrastructure, clashing economic goals, historical inequality. You can't really separate them.
And looking back at why those big cleanup efforts failed, the sources seem to agree on some key reasons.
Yeah, common themes emerge. Top-down planning, not enough local input, not involving universities enough, lack of coordination between agencies, and critically, problems with enforcement and sustaining political will over the long term.
Undermining the investments that were made.
Repeatedly. And this all came to a head with the 2016 Olympics, right?
Right. Huge international spotlight, promises made about cleaning the bay for sailing.
But the targets were missed. The sources detail that debate and the ultimate failure to deliver, which just underscored how deep the problems ran.
A very public display of the challenges.
It really put the bay's plight on the world stage, at least for a while.
So we've traced this journey today through the sources. From that stunning historical paradise to this incredibly complex, polluted reality.
Yeah.
Ambitious plans, repeated failures, but also, resilience from the people connected to it.
It really is a powerful, maybe sobering example. Rapid urbanization, development, environmental protection, all clashing, especially where you have profound social inequality.
One idea from the readings that really stuck with me was that maybe, just maybe, real change won't come just from big government plans. Maybe it has to come more from the local people, the fishermen, the residents.
That's a fascinating point raised in the material. It makes you wonder about the power of local knowledge, community action. Where does real transformation come from when top-down approaches seem to fail?
Yeah. Does it suggest something about how we tackle these huge environmental and social problems elsewhere? A really important question.
It absolutely does. Puts the focus on grassroots involvement and agency.
Definitely something to think about after this deep dive. So, reflecting on everything we've covered from these sources today, what's the one thing about Guanabara Bay's story that really stands out most to you?